Welcome to Crash Course Government in America. I'm Melanie.
I'm Anoom. I'm Giselle.
And I'm Jessica.
And today we're going to talk about money. That being said, let's get right into the show. The shackles of our day.
Too bad Congress isn't trying.
Actually, contrary to popular belief, Congress, or at least our current Congress, isn't to blame for the economy nowadays. Congress does have the constitutional authority to budget, that is to say, to add or subtract money from an agency, but they can't correct the mistakes of the past. The past 30 years have seen large annual budget deficits. A deficit is a shortage of something, usually money, especially when it comes to government, of the money we don't have. This explains our large national debt, which has skyrocketed since 1932, from billions to trillions, and then from 1980 to 2011, from $1 trillion to $15 trillion. So thanks, interest. Where could we be without you? Anyways, on to less depressing topics. The money that we do gain for revenue, we get from three major sources. Personal income tax, which is the tax we always have to deal with pretty much, corporate income tax, and social insurance taxes. We also get a little bit of revenue from excise taxes, which is basically what you pay every time you buy, for instance, a little cupcake from the store. Also good. Let's begin with income tax. Income tax is a portion of the money a person earns throughout the year. Usually, the more money you make, the more you'll have to pay to taxes, and it's usually considered more progressive because of this. Before income tax was officially upheld, or even necessary, it was used to pay for the Civil War, but that didn't go well, as can be seen by the 1895 court case Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Corporation. They had a really bad name. Basically, no one thought it was fair that the government could tax anyone regardless of state say. But in all fairness, it's not as if they had many sources of income. While the case ended in saying the income tax was unconstitutional, in 1913 it gave way to the 16th Amendment, which gave Congress the ability to levy an income tax and make money again. Woo! Next we have social insurance taxes, which come in the form of Medicare and Social Security. And these are taken directly from employers' paychecks and matched by their employers. Because our large baby boomer population is aging, and because in recent years the income tax has been cut, the social insurance tax has grown faster than any source of federal revenue, which means you're going to be taking care of your parents' parents, well, not really, because they're going to be dead, but your friends' parents, pretty much every old person. Our final source of federal revenue comes from the corporate income tax, which works the same way as individual income taxes, but for corporations. Unlike individual income tax, though, it's yielded less revenue than the individual level since 1943. Why? Well, we don't have the time to go over corporation intricacies. So from what we've learned, the federal government does have ways to get revenue, but our debt is super large. How do we afford everything along with that? Well, we kinda don't. When the federal government needs money, they have the Treasury Department sell bonds that can be bought by a plethora of sources. So citizens, foreign governments, which isn't the best idea, but let's pretend it is, corps, in order to be paid interest. This is known as deficit spending, and it allows for the current expenses to be paid, but at the cost of paying back that borrowed money with interest. Most borrowing is done for day-to-day expenses, such as farm subsidies, military pensions, and etc. But borrowing money shifts the burden to future taxpayers. So everything we ended up borrowing like 50 years ago, still here today. On a smaller scale, state governments, local governments, and private businesses have a capital budget when it comes to revenue. This means if something is long-term on their level, such as an airplane for, an airport, that means the money they borrowed for it is not counted towards the operating budget. Meanwhile, our federal government can't buy a fighter jet without getting a loan to fit into their operating budget. So, yeah, the federal government has it tough. Luckily, most expenditures do get paid off by taxes, which is some light at the end of the crippling country poverty tunnel. Tax expenditures are revenue losses from special exemptions allowed by federal tax law. They represent the difference between what was actually collected and what would have been collected if not for special exemptions. For instance, the wealthy like to pay charities because for them, they get money taken off of their taxes if they do so. A little not as charitable as you'd like to think, but it works. Congress doesn't regularly review them either, so it's really obscure in that sense. But for middle and upper income taxpayers, it's pretty nice since they get more out of it than the lower income people. And although the government could just lower the overall tax rates by taxing things usually not taxed, Social Security benefits, donations to organizations, stuff like that, they'd get a lot of backlash from it from powerful interest groups. And not just the angrily writes a letter talking about all the beef you have for it email or anything like that. Like, some really serious backlash that has to do with money and, of course, support for people in the seats of power in Congress. Though tax reduction sounds great and all, it puts more strain on the low-income families, mostly because the income tax load doesn't change, but social insurance and excise taxes do put a greater tax load on their shoulders. In order for Congress to try and fix these issues of funds, the government will grow rapidly following substantial tax cuts, mostly because citizens elect more government officials to handle the problem. And now, on to my colleague.
Hello there! The scope of government has skyrocketed since FDR's administration from 1933 to 45, all thanks to our ever-growing federal budget. This doesn't mean the government is increasingly controlling our lives, but that our social and economic conditions, as well as our incessant nagging, has forced the government to create new programs that can aid us. And of course, they need a lot of money to do so. World War II not only shook the world, but our economy too. It brought around two developments that are major factors in our increasing budget: national security and social security. For the first time after World War II, our military wasn't disbanded thanks to the Cold War, which led to the permanent establishment of our military and an increased acquisition of expensive military technology. This created the military-industrial complex, where a close relationship developed between the military and the defense industry that supplies the hardware. Boy, I said military a lot. That just proves how much military and war influences our budget.
Miss Yasmin, is it $1 billion?
Oh, me from the past, you wish. The budget for the Department of Defense fluctuates according to war and peace, and is used for payrolls and pensions for more than 7 million people at the Pentagon who serve in the reserves or receive military retirement pay. It is no longer as influential as it was in the past, where it was once the driving force of the expansion of the federal budget, but it still constitutes 1/5 of all federal expenditure. That's huge! Today, Social Security is what inflates the federal budget to its astounding $4 trillion. When we were complaining about our hard first world problems, Congress responded with the Social Security Act, which was intended to provide minimal levels of support to the elderly, poor, needy, and disabled through policies and programs such as Medicare. Now, these programs are great. They help millions of people in the nation, but they all come at a cost, a very expensive one. The money needs to come from somewhere. Do you know where that is? That's right, it's you and me and our tax dollars! As the budget goes up, so do our taxes. No wonder we have such a large debt. We can't even keep up with our programs and our own taxes. The apparent solution may be to cut programs we don't need and keep the ones we do, but it's a lot harder than it looks. The document is too big to review every year, and cutting programs is difficult to do when millions of people will be angered and upset by the sudden loss of amenities. So how do we control the budget? In a system called incrementalism. Congress starts with the previous year's budget and later debates how much the increment added will be. This guarantees a growth in the budget and isn't usually argued with because the programs that use this money really need more of it. This often leads to an uncontrollable expenditure, where the budget is very flexible and not determined by a fixed amount of money, but rather the beneficiaries who get it, which can end up in a very large gain in budget. I will now make way for my partner to further discuss the budgetary process.
We're gonna learn the budgetary process today. So budgetary politics is like a big game where all the players are serious about winning because they'd like a bigger budget. You've got interest groups, agencies, the president, the Office of Management and Budget, tax committees in Congress, which includes House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, and also budget committees and the Congressional Budget Office, subject matter committees, appropriation committees and subcommittees, Congress as a whole, and the Government Accountability Office, all competing like it's the Hunger Games. May the odds be ever in their favor. Now, 95 years ago, the president would have had little to no role in this process, But once the Budget and Accounting Act required presidents to propose an executive budget to Congress and the creation of the Bureau of the Budget, presidents have more importance in this process. Now named the Office of Management and Budget, aka OMB, by President Nixon, it supervises the year-long preparation of federal budgets. Beginning in the spring, the OMB presents the president with an analysis of the economic situation, who will establish guidelines and targets. Budget decisions are then conveyed to agencies so they can prep their budgets. They'll submit a budget estimate, and the OMB reviews them with the president, who decides the agency's budget. Agencies will have to conform to the president's decision, and the OMB again reviews the economy to draft the president's budget message. They'll revise and approve it, and finally submit the budget to Congress by the time it's winter. At one point, Congress had to reform its process with the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 to force the Congress to look at the budget as a whole by establishing a calendar, adding a budget committee in each house, and creating the Congressional Budget Office. An important part of the process is setting limits on expenditures on the basis of revenue projections through a budget resolution. Budget resolutions usually need changes, of which can happen in two methods: reconciliation and authorization bill. Reconciliation revises program authorization and most likely other tax changes. This usually happens at the end of the year. An authorization bill is an act of Congress that establishes or changes a government program and specify program goals and maximum expenditures for a discretionary program. Now, you'd think that these reforms would smooth out the process, but nope. None of that has been actually beneficial, and it doesn't help when presidents make proposals with large deficits. There are also moments when Congress doesn't follow its budgetary calendar, and when an agreement can't be reached and an appropriation bill passed, they use a continuing resolution, which makes agencies spend on last year's budget level. Now, how do we understand the centrality of budgeting? Well, that's not my problem. Whee!
Now I'm gonna explain what budgeting is. Basically, budgeting is the process of creating a plan of spending money. How does this relate to democracy?
Economists have claimed that this may be because everyone has an equal chance of voting, or equality of suffrage. Poor people who vote tend to support policies that redistribute the benefits from the rich to the poor, which is normal because people who aren't doing as well as the rich want to see change. They need help. But anyways, this is seen with Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and other social welfare programs that are benefiting the working and middle classes more than the rich. Seeing this, politicians try to gain people's votes by willingly helping voters get their benefits. So it's a win-win. While politicians are spending money to fund for these new programs, as many people and interest groups are asking for government assistance, the government is spending more money. Thus, the budget is increasing. And the money that they're spending is coming from the people through the payment of taxes. Now, people hate paying taxes, so the government has to face deficits and federal debt. Politicians compete with each other by not spending money, which in turn pleases the people because of no taxes, but people feel displeased when the programs that they support are cut. Likewise, corporations support a big government if it offers them contracts, subsidies, and other benefits. So it's like a you support me, I support you relationship. The budget is the scope of the government. So the bigger the budget, the bigger the government. And if the government doesn't have funding, then there's not much they can do to help us. And if the government doesn't have any funding, then there's not much they can do to help us. Thanks for watching. We look forward to seeing you guys in class.
If you have any questions, just go to school and ask Mr. Jimenez.